Is the United States an empire? I think it probably is. Almost 250 years old. That seems to be about when empires end. Let's delve in. Are we coming to the end? Can we make some changes? Can we redirect? Can we do a detour? You know, an expert on the Roman Empire, Jeremy Ryan Slate, joins me now. Jeremy, it's good to meet you. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great, Joe. I appreciate hanging out with you today.
It's very good to have you. You know, I'm from, well, I'm not from, but my grandfather was from Italy. So the Roman Empire certainly runs through my veins a little bit, although the Roman Empire was way more than Italy back in the day. But it lasted for a long time. And if I understand correctly, you're seeing the same sort of things that are showing chinks in our armor here that happened in the Roman Empire. First and foremost, when did the Roman Empire start? How long did it last?
So I think the thing that's important to understand first is Rome is really three periods in time. Like when
Okay.
people hear Rome, they often think of the empire period, but it's a kingdom first in 753 BC, and then it's a republic from 509 to 31 BC, and then the empire is 31 BC to 476 AD. So now when I look at where we are now, it's really interesting because Time Magazine put out an article about 2 years ago, and they're trying to say, is Donald Trump Julius Caesar? Because they always try to go for those shock tactics, right?
Right.
And I think the thing that's interesting is if you look at where America is, I really don't see us in a republic stage anymore. I think we've been an empire for quite some time. And if you look at Rome, in terms of its expanse and how it functioned, it was an empire before it was an empire as a form of government, right? Because
Okay.
after the Punic Wars, it's growing larger. But for me, I see 1913 as a really pivotal year for America because there's three things that happened that year.
Well, I want to stop you
First,
because we're going
yeah,
kind of fast. So just assume I know nothing. Assume I know nothing because I do. I know
yeah,
nothing. All right. So the Roman Empire is three different parts. I get that. I
yeah,
want to hear more about the republic state. Was it a
yeah.
republic like we allegedly were a republic or not? Was it exactly the same freedoms and liberties and representation for everybody? How did it work?
So the thing you have to understand first and foremost is there's the ways you would get political office. It's called the cursus honorum, and basically you had certain offices you had to hold by certain ages. So, for example, the highest office you could have, and there were two of them every year, was the idea of consul. And
Okay.
it's similar to being president, but it's like having two presidents every year, and they're only in office for a year. Um, and they would also be in charge of things like the military and larger things that are happening in
Are
the
they
Roman
voted in by the
Empire.
people?
They're not voted in by the people.
Okay.
They would be voted for by the political class. And I think that's a really important thing to understand too, is literacy rates at this point in time, you're looking at anywhere between 5 and 10%.
Oh, wow.
And that's where most of the wealth was as well. It's between 5 and 10%. So it's not quite a republic how we would think of America being a republic. It's closer to being an oligarchy in a lot of ways,
Gotcha.
but it's better than a lot of monarchies and other types of forms of government that had existed at that point in time where there is a bit more representation. When people hear the Roman Senate, I think the thing people don't really understand is the Senate didn't actually have any legislating power. They would basically recommend things, and it would be up to people in those given political offices to decide if it was going to be a law or not. They would just make recommendations.
And then the people just followed whatever they said because they were all dumb and couldn't read. I mean, is
For
that
the
what we're
for the
talking
most
about?
part, yeah. But I think there's also like something that's important to understand about Roman culture is they had something called a client system,
Okay.
where basically somebody that had a lot of money, wealth, political power would have people that would do things for them, right? They were called their clients,
Okay.
and they would owe their income to them, all these different things to them, and because of that, they would literally show up to the person's house every morning and figure out what their marching orders were for the day.
Wow.
So the way the system worked is very similar to how a Roman home would have worked. The Roman father in a house would be called the dominus, which translates to Lord,
Right.
and that system is run very much in the same way.
It's Jeremy Ryan's Slate. Go and check out his website. It's called commandyourbrand.com. Commandyourbrand.com. I'm guessing you can command your brand if you go there and find out what he does. So let's go back to 1913. So you want to talk about
Yeah.
the structure of the United States of America. Before 1913, I'm guessing you were talking about taxation. Before 1913, it really was a representative constitutional republic. Why don't you think it is now? What happened in 1913?
Well, so there's actually three pivotal things. First being the Federal Reserve. Our Treasury is no longer responsible for the money that we're spending here. Taxation is a big part of it, but another big piece that a lot of people leave out is the 17th Amendment. Um, because of the 17th Amendment, state legislatures no longer were selecting senators. So now you're getting senators and congressmen both being selected by popular vote. So now state legislatures, and this would have been really productive during the pandemic where state legislatures were getting loud but didn't have representation.
Yes.
So to me, that changes how the government functions dramatically. And then
Why was that change made, do you think, Jeremy?
Well, it was made to handle corruption, because what would happen is the governor would say, my brother, great senator. I think he would do an excellent job.
Yeah.
Or my cousin, he knows a guy. He'd be a great senator. So
but before the 17th Amendment, though, I mean, literally nobody was electing senators?
The state legislatures were.
Wow.
So oftentimes it would be whoever had the most political power in a state legislature would decide who the senator was going to be. So I get it why they wanted to make those changes. Corruption is a huge problem, but at the same time, it makes it so those state legislatures don't have voice. So I think there might have been other ways they could have looked at rooting out the corruption, but what you've really done is in a lot of ways turned us closer to democracy than we were before 1913, in more of a republic way of functioning.
The website is commandyourbrain.com. It's Jeremy Ryan Slate. So let's talk about the Federal Reserve for a moment. How did these bankers get away with taking the power away from the Treasury and basically making all of us borrow money from them instead of doing it the old-fashioned way? Because the bankers did it to protect themselves. This wasn't good for the people. It's not even a government entity, not really controlled by the government. It's a separate, independent thing that can spend $2.9 billion on new buildings of our money. How did they get away with that? What was the whole formation of the Federal Reserve about? And did the American people not understand it?
Well, I think part of it is as well. There's a great book I'd recommend to people to get a chance to read it. It's called The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. But there's a meeting at Jekyll Island, I believe earlier in 1913, where the large banking families get together and they decide, okay, we need to protect our investments. And how are we going to do that? We're going to make the U.S. government protect them. And the sneaky part about this is the Federal Reserve Act is actually passed when Congress is in break over Christmas. So there's not a lot of ability to actually say much about it. So I think that's the major issue is you have to look at, we're not as connected. We're as connected as we are now. So they're not going to be as well informed. And also it's done in a sneaky way where Congress isn't even in session and they're voting for this thing.
Can you undo it? I've asked that of top economists. I mean, the former chief economist at the Trump White House in the first time, Vance Ginn. I mean, the question I always have is, can you get rid of the Federal Reserve? It just seems to be too big now.
I would tend to agree with you. And I think one of the problems is, and Dr. Ron Paul has talked about this for years, just even an audit of the Fed would be great. Like, let's know what's actually there and what's actually happening, right? Because, and this, we can talk about this later on when we talk about the Roman Empire, but if you look at inflation and how it's fueled, the government creates a bill. The bill needs to be funded. The Federal Reserve creates money through a process that's called quantitative easing, which means they just take and make more dollars.
Right.
So that's a really dangerous process. And by 284 AD, Romans are at 15,000% inflation. Could you imagine if they had a computer, what they could do with that? Like, to be in that position.
15,000%?
15,000% inflation.
What caused it?
Well, there's a whole lot of pieces to that. So if you want to get into that, we can definitely dive.
No, because
okay.
I see direct parallels between that and us having $38 trillion in debt and pretending like it's not a big deal. It is a big deal. Yeah.
Well, if you look at the 3rd century, so that's the 200s through the 300s, that's a really pivotal point in time in the Roman Empire. Marcus Aurelius, who dies in 180, is the last of what are known as the 5 good emperors.
Okay.
And they had a process of selecting the next emperor by not naming their natural born child. They would select the person closest to them and name them the next emperor. And this works really well for 5 emperors. Now, none of them had children, so it wasn't really a competition who the next person was going to be.
Right.
Aurelius does have a son, so to not name Commodus would have created civil war. So Commodus is so hated that there's basically a revolution after Commodus dies in 192. There's 5 emperors in a year, and the last of these is a guy named Septimius Severus. He's from North Africa, and what he does is he changes the process in how the military is paid. When an emperor would take office, they would get what's known as a donative, and that's basically a gift of money you would give to the military to keep their allegiance.
Okay.
And then the legions would also be paid every year as well. So he gives the largest donative ever to that point, and emperors after him will pass that, but he also doubles legionary pay. And this process through the 3rd century is going to continue where emperors are doubling the pay, tripling the pay, etc. And you get towards the end of the 3rd century, there's something called the crisis of the 3rd century. And this is where military commanders are declaring themselves emperor, attacking Rome with an army, and declare and basically taking power. So in a less than 50-year period, you have 27 emperors from
Oh, wow.
238 to 284. So you can imagine they're doubling, tripling, quadrupling pay. What's happening to the money? Now, the other problem you have, because you have
Was
two
the money
other
not
problems-
backed up by anything, Jeremy? Because, I mean, if you can back it up, it doesn't matter how much you pay them. If you have the gold or the valuable something to back it up, was it just not backed up by anything?
Well, so they start a process of currency debasement. So a lot of their
Okay.
currency would have been gold and silver. You have a problem where people start hoarding gold. So most of the gold is not in circulation. People are hoarding it. But what's actually happening is these coins, they're adding other base metals to them. So a silver coin in the first century that was 95% pure, by the end of the third century, it's 5% pure.
Yeah, I get it
So it's
now.
basically, the silver coin is basically a bronze coin.
Right.
Now you have two other problems that are contributing to this inflation. The other is an immigration problem, which may sound familiar to a lot of people.
An immigration problem? Get out of here.
An immigration problem, right. So since all these emperors are fighting each other and declaring themselves emperors, well, they need more soldiers. So they had always, to some extent, used barbarians in the Roman army.
Okay.
But now, since you have such a high need for soldiers, they have more and more barbarians fighting in the Roman army. So you have
I want to delve into this a lot. And I don't mean to interrupt because I get the feeling I get the feeling you could speak for 3 hours and it'll all be great. but the way my brain is hearing you, it's taking me in different directions. Let's talk specifically about immigration. How did immigration work? Were there borders? Were there barriers? Were there walls? Were there fences? And were there people guarding those walls and fences? And is immigration the beginning of the end for an empire like that?
So I think, to a certain extent, when a civilization becomes less of the people that live there and becomes something else, it does kind of start to become the beginning of the end. But the thing I'll say is in Rome, this changes over time. If you're looking kind of in the Republic era, what Rome did is when they conquered new areas, they wouldn't ask for tax money. They would say, just provide us with soldiers. And that would be the way that they did kind of their early conquest. And to fuel the empire through money, they would conquer more territory, more places, whatever. In 117 AD, Emperor Trajan changes the policy, and he says, all right, we're not going to conquer anymore. We're just going to hold what we have. And then after him, the next emperor, Hadrian, is the one that builds the famous Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Okay. So there are borders to what this empire is, but it really stops growing after 117 AD, and they're just trying to hold on to what they have. Now, if you go a little bit further down the road in 212 AD, the purse of the empire isn't really doing so well at that point. The treasury is bankrupt. So Emperor Caracalla decides he's got a great idea on how he's going to make more money, because one of the biggest things they could tax was people's inheritance. So he grants citizenship to 30 million people overnight. Wow. And now he's watered down the idea of citizenship, but he can tax them. So, hey, it's a great solution. So you start to lose what is Romanness, right? So, and when you're looking at the military, they had allegiance to Rome because Rome was paying them. But as the money's worth less and less and less, and there's more and more barbarians, well, they don't need Rome anymore. And that's kind of what happens in the fall of Rome. It's not this, wailing and mashing of teeth that people want to make it out to be. It really is more of a system changing into a new system. And a lot of it has to do with the money.
It's Jeremy Ryan Slate. Go to commandyourbrain.com. Really incredible information. He's an expert on the Roman Empire. So, I mean, what you just said, 30 million people get citizenship overnight. I think that's what Biden wanted to do. I think that's what Obama wanted to do. So is it a direct parallel? Had they gotten away with making 20 to 25 million illegal alien citizens of the United States, would it have looked an awful lot like what you just explained to me?
Well, I think yes, it would have. But I think also the thing you have to understand is if you even look at places like California, a lot of the congressional districts are based not even off of citizens, but just the number of people that are here.
Yes.
So if you look at a state like California, they probably have 5 to 7 congressional seats they probably shouldn't actually have. So even without making those people citizens, we're still going really quickly that way. So I think it is a major concern, but we've already started the process.
Well, is that why a place like California is basically running in the negative all the time? Why the homeless situation is out of control? Because you're right. I mean, for those watching and listening, they know this. We talk about it all the time. A representative district is about 760,000 people, and it's just people. It's not citizens. There is a push by some people to make it citizens only or those here legally only. We'll see if they can get away with that. Probably not. But is that specifically why a California or an Illinois or a Massachusetts that run very liberal policies and the big cities all act as sanctuaries, that's why they're having so much trouble?
Well, I think it's probably a lot deeper than that, but I think that's also a major cause, right? Because if you look at, I think Arnold Schwarzenegger did a video not long about this. If you look at a state like Massachusetts, Massachusetts, I think it was like is like 50 something percent conservative as a state, but they actually don't have much conservative representation at all
They
because a
have
lot
none.
of the
They
major
literally have zero conservative.
right. So
there are no
so they have
Republican
no
representatives.
right. So they have no representation because of the way the maps are drawn. I'm
Right.
in northern New Jersey, and we are like the reddest part of the state. And for years, we were represented by a Republican representative. They redistricted us about 10 years ago and pulled us into a lot more higher population density representation. And we've been represented by Josh Gottheimer ever since, a
Wow.
Democrat. So this is part of the problem, is the way congressional maps are played with and the way representation is based. They're able to shift politics to basically deal with the things they want.
So when Rome does what we're talking about and 30 million people get citizenship, the emperor can now tax them, but it waters down the culture. Whatever the culture
Correct.
was, it was less Roman, as you said. So how long does it take for the new influx of 30 million people to say, we'll make it like our culture instead of like your culture? When does it start to crumble?
So not initially, and I think that's something you have to understand, is like people come to Rome for the culture of it. So
Okay.
they would have Roman governments in these places. You would have people that might have been born, let's say in Carthage, but they're living as a Roman. Like people want to be part of that culture.
Right.
As you get later into the 3rd century and these emperors are fighting each other and the barbarian troops start pushing in, Rome had agreements with them to basically sit on the borders, protect the borders, and not let other barbarian tribes in, but they stopped keeping those agreements. So then the barbarian tribes start pushing in, and that's when you start to see more of a problem, is towards the late 3rd century and into the 3rd and 4th. And you're going to have, in 376, a Roman emperor actually falls in Roman territory to barbarians. That's what you're basically seeing towards the end there.
So once let's now go to modern day again. Once we stopped, adding states, we have Alaska and Hawaii. They're the last two, and then you got some territories out there that of course we have Puerto Rico and so on. We got a district in Washington D.C. That's when we had the Rome moment where we said, all right, we like what we have. Let's now protect it. And a bunch of more people were let in, depending on how liberal or progressive or how power hungry the people were that were running it. And those people coming in don't want to be Romans, don't want to be Americans. Those people coming in are flying their flag from wherever they came from. And then now you've got enclaves in this country of that culture instead of, everybody wanting to be American. Is that the same thing that happened with Rome? You started to have enclaves of whatever the barbarian tribe happened to be. We're going to be more like we used to be, and we're not going to be Roman. Is that why the breakdown happened?
Well, this is what you start to see in the mid to late 4th century is eventually it had always been important to adopt Roman culture, right? It had been expected if you're living in Rome, you adopt Roman culture in certain points. In the late 4th century, the Roman emperors start allowing barbarians to rule themselves and to keep in their own culture, but within Roman territory. You could say that's very similar to what's happening in Michigan right now, or it's very similar to what's happening in Minnesota right now, where we're slowly losing parts of our territory and losing the identity of what it means to be American. That doesn't mean that an American has to be a white Anglo-Saxon, but it does mean we have a culture and we have things that are expected here. When you lose those things, you lose your civilization.
It's such an important point. In Dearborn, Michigan, Hamtramck, Michigan, you've got the actual call to prayer that is not of this culture. We're a Judeo-Christian culture, and we don't have that. We also have mayors who are saying, we can't wait for you to leave this city. We'll do a parade when you leave. We've got people like you said, Minnesota, Ilhan Omar, who literally is saying, I'm in Congress to do the work of Somalians. So, I mean, that does show exactly what you're talking about. So the barbarians decided we're going to take it for our own, going to have our own culture, fly our own flag, screw Rome. And was that just a massive war then?
Well, so what really starts to happen is this goes back to the money. As I mentioned, they have faith in Rome for the money they're getting. But what starts to happen is Rome starts they have barbarians in the legion. They start to use barbarians as commanders. And if you look at when Rome is sacked in 410, it's sacked by a Visigoth named Alaric.
Okay.
Previously in life, Alaric had been working as a Roman commander. And when he's not getting the political position he wants and the money he wants, well, he attacks Rome. And that's what starts to happen in the early 5th century and kind of towards the end of that, as Rome doesn't make it through the 5th century. That's what starts to happen is they have Roman commanders. Those commanders turn on Rome, they attack Rome, and the West doesn't last very long.
Jeremy Ryan Slate is the man's name. Go and check him out at commandyourbrand.com, commandyourbrand.com. Did they have what we modern day call entitlements? They're not really entitlements. They're just freebies. They're giveaways. Was Rome doing that? Hey, vote for me, keep me in power, or love me, kiss my toes, whatever, however it worked back then. Were they handing them free stuff?
So yes, they were, and that's actually, as I mentioned, that this inflationary issue has several causes. One is just what they were doing with the money to pay the military. The other is this immigration problem and the citizenship issue. The other actually is the entitlement programs. And if you go towards the late Republic, and we're talking about 133 is the year when this starts.
Okay.
133 to 31 is what's referred to as the Roman Civil War. The guy that comes up on top of that is Augustus, and he's your first emperor. But in 133, there's a gentleman named Tiberius Gracchus, and the position he holds is called Tribune of the Plebs. And he is somebody that had been coming back from the Punic Wars, and he's observed how people aren't really doing that well, so he wants to give everyone free grain. And one of the things you have to understand about the Roman kind of civilization, the thing that allowed it to rise, in addition to other causes, but one of the main causes that allowed it to rise is something called the Roman climate optimum. So from about 200 BC to 200 AD, they have the best weather you could imagine. So they're growing grapes and grain and olives in places that they wouldn't grow now. So they have an ability to have all this grain to feed people. What starts to happen is this grain dole is now given to all these citizens in Rome. In the middle of the 3rd century, around 250, the climate changes. Okay. And the major place a lot of the grain was coming from was Egypt, which by this point in time had been a Roman territory for hundreds of years.
Now what year was that?
This is 250.
So in 250, I do believe the Cadillac Escalade was invented in 250. Could have been causing the climate change. Sorry, smart-ass conservative remark. When you said climate change, I had to jump in. All right, so the climate is great. You're growing grapes, you're growing grain, everybody's eating, everybody's getting free stuff, and then something changes, and then what? The goods run out?
So what would happen is the Nile River would flood every year, and that delta would become very rich and very fertile, and that's where a lot of the grain was coming from and then being imported to the rest of the empire. In 250, the Nile doesn't flood, and then it starts flooding every other year, and then for a long period of time, it doesn't flood at all. Okay. So what does that do is it causes grain prices to double, triple, and continue to go up. So now you have a higher cost of having to feed people. So that's also going to feed that inflationary problem. And I guess a funny point about that is when there's a grain issue in 250, in addition to these barbarian invasions, the Emperor Decius has a great idea. He says, I think the problem is we haven't been sacrificing to the gods enough. So he says that we need to have more sacrifices to the Roman gods. And this is actually a major persecution of Christians that occurs at this point in time.
Wow.
Because he thinks we need to handle this issue with people not worshiping Roman gods. And I'm sure we'll get more grain and these barbarians will leave us alone.
I'm guessing that didn't work, but they just started killing Christians?
What you would see is when things aren't going well in Rome, very often Christians were made as the butt of it. In 64 AD, under Nero, when the fire of Rome happens, he blames the fire of Rome on Christians. When things aren't going well under Emperor Decius, he blames it on the Christians. In 284, when Diocletian is trying to bring peace back to this empire after the crisis of the 3rd century, well, they go after the Christians again. Wow. And that's what you're going to see is a lot of persecutions of Christians happen when times aren't going well.
Is it a coincidence or is it a direct parallel in how things are happening in this country? For a long time, it's starting to change, but woke meant that you can't be a white heterosexual Christian male in this country because you somehow were the worst of the worst and you caused any pain that I have in my life. It's not a persecution of Christians where they're sacrificing us, but certainly if you're a Christian person in this country, for a long time, your status was diminished because people blamed you for everything. Is that a coincidence, or is that exactly what was going on in Rome?
I don't know if it's a coincidence as much as people always look for someone to blame. And in a pagan society, you're going to look for who's different. And that's what they did in Rome, right? Christians are also often the most persecuted in this point in time, but it would be Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians and anybody that wasn't really Roman. It's just that Christians were the larger population out of those.
So what do we do in this society today, learning from the lessons of Rome? Because 250 years next year, that sounds about time. I think I could be wrong, completely wrong about this, but I thought somewhere in my upbringing, I learned that an empire lasts a couple of hundred years. So are we about at that limit that an empire would start to crumble? And what do you do to stop it from happening?
Well, I think a really good example of this, as I mentioned, Rome is three eras in time. It's a
Yeah.
kingdom, republic, and an empire. But the thing that people often neglect to talk about is the Roman East in history is often called the Byzantine Empire. But the Byzantine Empire, they would have seen themselves as Romans and they would have called themselves the Roman Empire
Really?
because they really are Romans just in the East. Because around 284, Diocletian splits the empire between two major emperors and two minor emperors, and you're going to see the power center start to shift east. The name Byzantium only comes from the 16th century when they're trying to figure out how to describe this culture because they are essentially Roman, but they also don't want to create a problem for the Holy Roman Emperor that's popped up at this time.
Wow.
But they really would have considered themselves Romans, and they can trace the emperors directly back to Roman emperors that had been around since around 305. So when you look at that,
I've had some guests on, and again, you just make my brain work. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I've had some guests on who said we basically from the Byzantines have a lot of what Western culture is today. Is that true?
it's true in a lot of ways, and the thing you can look at is even a lot of medieval culture comes out of that, but you have to go a little bit earlier. As I mentioned, Diocletian divides the empire in 284, and he realized it got too big for one man to control. And you have all these warring emperors and whatever it might be. So he creates two junior emperors and two senior emperors, and he basically creates what's called the tetrarchy, which means rule by four. And in this, he does a bunch of major reforms too. He breaks down the empire into smaller pieces to make them easier to control, and he calls these dioceses. That's the word that the Catholic Church uses comes from. He also creates new positions. There is a person that's in charge of running a diocese that's called a vicar. There is a person that's in charge of the military outposts. He's called a dux. That's where the word duke comes from.
Right.
And then he also creates this position that controls the borders called a soldier called a comites. And the comites is where the word count comes from. So he creates a lot of these positions that will continue in the East and actually creates the medieval world.
It's all very interesting to me. When you say comites, I think of posse comitatus, which has been bandied about a lot in this country lately about how can military go in and do law enforcement activities? The answer is no, but they certainly can protect people's rights. It's Jeremy Ryan Slate. Go and check him out, commandyourbrand.com, commandyourbrand.com. So how are we mirroring what they were doing then? If you were to decide, if I were to say, Jeremy, what stage of republic or empire or kingdom are we in the United States in 2025? What would you say?
Well, I'll answer that in just a second, but I want to add one more thing about the Eastern Empire because I think this piece is important because you asked about what do we do about this in this area of decline?
Okay.
So the Eastern Empire survives for almost 1,000 years after the Western Empire. It doesn't fall until 1453 under the Ottomans.
Okay.
And oftentimes Constantine the Great, who's one of the first major Eastern emperors, is given credit for bringing Christianity to the empire, which he does after the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 or 313. But the thing that he does that most people don't really talk about is he changes the currency. In 314, he mints a few hundred gold coins, and he's going to mint a few hundred more gold coins every year until he dies in 337. Until by the time he dies, the East is on a gold standard. Now, we talked earlier about people hoarding gold. So he requires gold to be paid in taxes, so now people will no longer hoard it. And that currency is going to go from 337 to around the year 1000 without inflation. So if you want to say, how do we fix our situation now? We have to fix our currency. And I think that is the really big underlying issue to everything we're dealing with right now. Well,
it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, though. How do you fix the currency if we're basically borrowing the money from the Federal Reserve? And we have no idea even how much gold, if any, is at Fort Knox. Is it a matter of going back to the gold standard and just taking the pain until we get things realigned? At $38 trillion in paper debt, and you're right, every time they do a quantitative easing move, you had quantitative easing 2, you had all this stuff. The $20 bill in my pocket or in my bank is worth less than it was before they did that. So how do you do it? In action, what do you do?
Well, I think that the biggest thing you have to do, which I think is when we're looking at tariffs, I know people have complained about it, but I think in some ways we have to bring industry back here. And I think that is what an effort to do is.
Yes.
We have to have an economy that creates things here because we really don't. We become a service-based economy in a lot of ways. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is cutting waste. And we haven't really done a great job with that. I know the beginning of this year, Trump was really working hard at that, but he got a lot of pushback from Congress. And I think if we don't cut waste, it doesn't matter if we fix currency because we're going to continue snowballing. But we have to have industry, we have to cut waste, and then we can worry about fixing our currency. I'm not an economist. I don't know if the gold standard is the right move because we're so far over our skis at this point in time. But our money needs to be based on something, or they can just continue to inflate it by just creating new dollars like they are.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's based on nothing, and you're absolutely right. Jeremy Ryan Slate, go right now to Command Your Brand. He's the CEO of CommandYourBrand.com. Go and check that out, and go watch all the videos that he does as well. So let's get. I've got probably about 10 minutes left, and I love all the time you're giving me. I really want to break this down. Where are we right now when we see a Mamdani take over New York City? When we see, as you mentioned, in Michigan, in also in Minnesota, I think in Maine, there's a large population of either Somalians or Liberians or something. What do you do when you've got an influx of that many people that are not of the same culture, that don't want to drop their culture? Is there a way that you saw Rome at some point in either the kingdom, the empire, or the republic, where they forced people to say, look, when in Rome, do as the Romans do? I'm sure that's where the saying comes from. Were they able to force that upon people? And I don't mean force by killing them or anything, but make them understand, you're here, you came here because this land, this place offers you better than where you came from. Stop trying to make it like where you came from. Did that happen in Rome?
Well, the Western Empire is never really able to solve that, and that's one of the main reasons it falls in 476. The Eastern Empire, as I mentioned, they fix their currency, and if you have a strong currency, you have the most power and you can make the rules. And I think that's what you really have to look at as an example. But if you want to say, where are we now? I think we're in our late 3rd century moment now. And if you look at where Rome was in the 3rd century, they have a break-off empire in the west called the Gallic Empire, a break-off empire in the east called the Palmyran Empire. So now they're controlling less territory. They have barbarians pushing in from the north, and their money's been dramatically inflated. There's a man in 274 that in a 5-year period brings back the west, brings back the east, and starts to fix the currency. And for his troubles and for the good work he does, his name is Aurelian, he's assassinated. So I think if you look at where we are, I think we are in this point of time where we're in danger of starting to actually lose control over some of our territories, and our money is out of control. We don't really have Congress people declaring themselves president and raising armies, but I don't know if something like that is all that far off from how our political climate is right now. So I do think we're really in our mid-3rd century moment right now.
So who kills the guy that Aurelian is his name? Who kills that guy because as he's fixing it? So the person who kills him wants there to be concentrated power and all the money in a few people's hands instead of fixing it? I mean, why get rid of him?
Well, his secretary is the one that kills him, and he would kill him in hopes that the military would stick with him and make him the next emperor, which is always the goal.
Wow.
And what ends up happening is a military tribunal gets together and they pick an old guy named Tacitus who really doesn't want to be emperor. And that's where you're really at in that point in time, where you don't live long being in this office in the crisis of the 3rd century. So nobody really wants to hold the job towards the 270s. And that's what people are looking at. If I can take out the big guy, I'm the big guy. And that's why you have these militaries attacking each other.
And that's why Trump was almost assassinated. You know, a couple of times they attempted it. I mean, there are some parallels there. Let me ask you this, because I just don't know, Jeremy. Were there any human rights, God-given human rights, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom to call out the government? Could you do any of that stuff? Could you carry a firearm or a weapon, whatever it was of the day?
So weapons weren't allowed in the city of Rome. There's something called the Palmarium, which is a sacred line around the city, and troops were actually supposed to disband once they were in the city. And this is more in the Republic period.
Okay.
In the Empire, the only people that were allowed to have weapons were the military, specifically the Praetorian Guard, because they were the ones that were allowed to be armed inside the city. In terms of what rights look like, it's really hard to compare that to now, because if you spoke out against someone in power, as I mentioned, it's a client system. Well, you could speak out against someone in power, but you lose your way of living. You may lose different jobs for your family. So those are things you would have to consider. So the system is quite different than ours in certain ways. So you could have freedom of speech and you could say what you want, but you might lose your ability to actually support your family and make money.
Did they stop the entitlement programs? Did they finally say, we're not going to give you a fish, we're going to teach you how to fish, or you're going to go and provide for yourself and your family? Did that ever stop, or was that part of the downfall?
It was part of the downfall, honestly, because what ends up happening is there's no more money, there's no more ability to feed people, and you've kind of lost your point where you can reform this. So for the Western Empire, it really is a big part of the fall, and it's not something they're able to reform.
Well, it's exactly what Obama did in his 8 years. He put 40-some-odd million Americans on entitlements that before him were not on there, and he acted like they deserved it. They were, in fact, entitled to it. And then you've got Biden, because of the pandemic, added $2 trillion to the spending, and they don't want to get rid of any of it. So when you try to pull some of that back, you've got the left in this country complaining about they want to take away food out of the children's mouths and they want to take away health care from those who have it. So once it's in place, historically, even all the studies that you've done, it's not easy to take it away once people have it.
No, it becomes very hard to remove, because you even look at the conversations they've been having about Obamacare, right?
Yeah.
Now it's so ingrained in how things are happening, and the government is literally paying insurance companies, which that's a great gig for them if you can get it.
Yes.
But it becomes hard to remove anything. You asked earlier about the Federal Reserve, how to remove that. Well, it's so ingrained. How do you remove that? And I think that's something you run into, is when bureaucracy gets so built up and becomes something people have known for so long. Well, how do you remove it?
How would you define what the Roman Empire was, what the kingdom was, what the republic was? Were they literally dictatorships, all of them? Were they socialist, as we would compare them to today? What were they politically?
Well, if you want to look at the Roman Republic, I really think it's more of a oligarchy in a lot of ways, where it is really the wealthy do control a lot of things. There is an ability through hard work for people to rise, but it's very rare that could happen. If you look at the Empire period, it really is a very thinly veiled dictatorship. And if you want to look at what that looks like, Augustus, who's the first emperor, as I mentioned, Rome was a kingdom in the beginning. And because of that, Romans hated the idea of kingship. And that's the reason that Julius Caesar was assassinated, is they had the idea he could make himself a king. And Augustus is very smart, and he knows this. So what he does is he creates a new word to call himself, and that's the princeps, or the Prince of Rome. This word prince came from the person that spoke first in the Senate, the princeps senatus, or the Prince of the Senate. Okay. So he takes this name to say, well, I'm a first citizen above all the rest of you, but I'm not a king. And it really creates a thinly veiled monarchy that obviously later on is going to become a lot more obvious to people as a monarchy, but by that point in time, what are you going to do about it? That's how you've lived for hundreds of years.
A much more superficial question, but I've always wondered this. Why don't we speak Latin anymore anywhere on this planet? I mean, they spoke Latin in the Roman Empire, right?
They spoke Latin in the Roman empires, but here's an interesting thing, is a lot of wealthy would have actually spoken Greek to each other. Because
really?
It's a much, I guess it's seen as a much more cultured language compared to Latin during that period of time. Latin would have sounded a little rougher, and Greek would have sounded a little nicer. So a lot of the wealthy likely wrote and spoke in Greek, though a lot of official proclamations were in Latin. Why don't we speak Latin has to do a lot with what happens in the Middle Ages. And people wanted to be able to speak their own languages, and Latin becomes kind of just a language of the church. And medieval Latin is also very different than ancient Latin, as a lot of the words sound different. They're written differently. Okay. So I think it really just comes down to, as the Roman Empire splinters and starts to become other different power centers, well, people want to continue to speak their own language. And the church is going to use that for a really long time. But starting in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, it's going to start to go more towards people using their own languages.
I just find it to be so interesting, because he goes, okay, the root of this word comes from the Latin for blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, why don't we just speak Latin then? Why is everything based on it, but we don't speak it? It's Jeremy Ryan Slate. Go to commandyourbrain.com, commandyourbrain.com. Let's finish with this. Should the president see this, or the vice president? Who knows? They might watch. I've had them on the show a million times. What advice, direct advice, would you give them? The way you stop, this system and this country from failing, this republic from ending, you should start with doing this. Is it as simple as close the border, which he's done? Is it as simple as stop the monetary, the spending of money that isn't backed by anything? Is there anything else that we want to throw their way?
Well, I think it goes back to what I said earlier, and I think the tariffs have actually played a bigger part in this. I think people are looking at it for the wrong reasons. They're like, oh, we're making money on people importing things, when actually, if you look at, there's automotive manufacturers, other companies that have started to bring manufacturing back here. So I think the first thing
is a leverage play.
Reestablishing a manufacturing base here. And I think the second part is cutting waste, which Trump tried really hard to do, but got a ton of pushback on. And then we have to fix the currency. You do those three things, then we are in really good shape. But if you don't do those three things, we will go the way of Rome.
Was there a time in the Roman Empire where they said, we're taking back the so-called entitlements, but we're going to benefit you by doing this? Okay, we're taking away the entitlements, but we got a great job for you. I mean, did something like that? Because you have to give them something. You can't just say, no more welfare, no more food stamps, no more SNAP, no more WIC. You can say that if you say, but don't worry, we're going to hook you up this way. Did Rome do that with employment or anything?
They never took it back. One thing I will say, as I mentioned, those entitlement programs started in 133 BC. Yeah. Julius Caesar, when he's dictator in 44 BC, does actually take that program and streamline it, at least, so they're wasting a little bit less. But there isn't really a time where they take those things back, and it does become a major thing. The idea of bread and circus comes from people were literally getting grain to make bread from their government, and people were very, very involved in gladiatorial games and chariot races, and a bigger part of it was the gambling on it. People would gamble away so much money that they would be so consumed by these things because they could lose their entire living on all the gambling they were doing.
Jeremy Ryan Slate, I get the feeling that we can talk another 7 times, and I still just have a ton of questions. Thanks for your incredible knowledge. I'm glad you studied this as deep as you have, and that your knowledge is incredible. I take you at your word for all. You could have been lying this entire interview, and I would have no idea. But it has the feeling of being true because I've seen your platform. You've got a very large one. Go and follow him. He's a Roman Empire expert, a podcast host, JeremyRyanSlate.com, or go to CommandYourBrain.com. Promise me that you'll come back again. I've got a million more questions, all right?
Hey, Joe, absolutely. You just let me know when, man.
I really appreciate your time and the knowledge. Thank you so much. That's it for Unshaken and Unafraid with Joe Pags for this time. Make sure that you stick around for the next one.